This brief presentation is on free trade. Free trade is the international exchange of goods and services without any government intervention. And it comes with many benefits. For consumers, there is low prices as well as greater variety, greater choice. We'll talk about that when we look at the diagram next. Free trade also encourages competition. Domestic firms now will have to compete against foreign firms, and the firms won't like that, of course. However, they will have to find ways to become more efficient to compete against a greater field of producers in whatever field they're in, and that will overall lead to greater efficiencies. Factor endowments means the factors of production. Some countries have greater access to some factors and limited access to other factors. Looking at natural resources is a great example of this. Some countries may not have access to a particular natural resource, and the only way to acquire that resource would be through trade. Throughout history, Japan is probably the most prominent example of that, lacking many of the resources needed to industrialize, but using trade to acquire those resources and growing into one of the strongest economies in the world today. Specialization is the idea that if you're trading with other countries, you can specialize in what you are really good at. So an example is country A can produce coal and oil. It can produce both, but it is very efficient at producing coal. It can produce quadruple the amount of coal than it can oil. So let's say that rather than trying to split its productive resources on producing both of those materials, it just focuses on coal. It specializes on coal, and then it trades that coal to get the goods that it could produce, but it can't do a very good job at producing those products. So specialization is only possible because of trade. Economies of scale is the idea that when you are trading as a firm, you have access to a much larger market, and that allows you to save certain costs, such as transportation costs. You can now transport in bulk. It might also allow you to have some workers who specialize on specific tasks. So one example is if the production of your goods has 5 different tasks, but you only have one worker, then he needs to know all 5 tasks. If you can multiply your market 5-fold, now you can hire 5 times the amount of workers, because now you need to produce 5 times the amount of products. And instead of that one worker knowing all 5 tasks, he can just focus on one responsibility, and then your 4 new workers each can get a new responsibility, and everyone can, there's that term specialization again, but in a different way. Each worker could specialize on one task, and the economy of scale, because you're operating at a bigger level, it allows for greater efficiency. And finally, political relationships. When you trade with another country, it's not hard to understand that they would become allies. So trade promotes that. There is a degree of interdependence, but also just the nature of trade requires countries to communicate with each other. And so it could, again, provide footing for a solid international relationship between 2 nations. So here we see a regular microeconomic diagram with an equilibrium price and quantity. Equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity, demand, and supply. But for our purposes here, instead of just writing supply, we're going to call it S domestic. Now, really, whenever we draw a microeconomic diagram, it essentially is S domestic, but we're not focusing on the world supply in those examples. But now, since we're doing free trade, we write S domestic. That's important because now we're going to draw an S world line, and that represents world supply. And it's a theoretical line. It's perfectly elastic, and what it is suggesting is once you introduce the international supply into a market, it's almost like an unlimited supply at this lower price, PW or P world, however you would like to label it. And notice that this world price is lower than PE. If the world could not offer a product at a lower price, then there would be no reason that our domestic consumers would even consider buying the product. So let's kind of use this with an example. Let's pretend we're talking about a particular or just in general cars. So what happens to satisfy the demand, first consumers are buying from domestic. They buy from the domestic supply from 0 to Q1, some quantity of cars, maybe 1 million cars, and they would be, without trade, they would just keep buying from domestic. They'd keep buying from domestic, and they'd buy cars up to this price. Maybe this is 5 million cars that were sold every year in the United States, and here was the equilibrium price for the cars. But because of the world trade, the free trade, consumers, while they'll still buy some of the domestically made cars, they'll go on to buy a lot more cars now from the world supply. Along this line here, up to this quantity, Q2. So we see the lower price because now consumers can buy from P at the price P world instead of PE. And we also see a greater overall quantity being consumed instead of just QE being consumed. Now Q2, a larger quantity is being consumed. But the domestic producers are being hurt. The domestic producers were enjoying 0 to QE of their products. Again, let's pretend that's 5 million cars being consumed. But now only 1 million cars, 0 to Q1, are being consumed from domestic producers. And maybe Q1 to Q2 represents 6 million. And so the other 6 million cars in this market are coming from the world supply, to the harm of the domestic producer instead. So the consumer enjoys lower prices, they enjoy greater variety, and that is reflected in Q2 being further from the origin than QE. But the domestic producers are losing a significant chunk of the market in this case. And we'll talk about that in the next presentation about protectionism, why that's a bad thing. So that really wraps up free trade.